The padlock was still warm from the afternoon sun when I found it, bolted through a brand new wrought iron gate that had been installed directly across the base of my wheelchair ramp sometime while I was at a physical therapy appointment. And I remember sitting in my chair at the bottom of that ramp for a long moment, just staring at it, trying to understand how a woman could look at a ramp built for a disabled army veteran and decide the most urgent problem in the entire neighborhood was that it didn't match the approved fence styling guidelines closely enough. My name is Harlan Voss. I served 2 tours overseas before an IED outside Kandahar took most of the function in my left leg and left me, after 11 surgeries and 3 years of rehab, using a wheelchair full-time for anything beyond very short distances. My wife Michaela and I bought our house in Fernwood Crossing, a community of about 280 homes, almost 4 years ago, specifically because the layout allowed for a single-level entry that made a proper ramp installation straightforward, and specifically because, when we submitted our original ramp proposal to the HOA Architectural Review Committee, back then, under a board led by a genuinely kind man named Walter Prout, the approval came back within a week, along with a personal note from Walter saying he was glad the community could support what our family needed. Walter retired from the board about 1.5 years ago, replaced through an uncontested election by a woman named Dolores Ashworth Hayes, and I want to walk you through exactly how Dolores's particular brand of leadership unfolded over her first year in office, because I think the pattern matters enormously for understanding how something as absurd as a locked gate across a disability ramp actually came to happen. Dolores ran her board presidency around what she called, in her first newsletter, a renewed commitment to architectural cohesion, and within her first 6 months, that commitment had produced a wave of citations across the neighborhood that struck most of us as bewilderingly petty. A family 2 streets over got cited because their new mailbox post was a slightly different shade of black than the community standard. Another neighbor received a violation notice over decorative solar path lights that Dolores deemed visually inconsistent with the evening streetscape. My own ramp, which had stood unchanged and unremarked upon for over 3 years under Walter's board, received its first citation from Dolores about 8 months into her term, a letter informing me that the ramp's railing style, a simple, sturdy aluminum design chosen specifically for its grip strength and whether durability rather than its aesthetics, violated a newly clarified guideline requiring all front-facing structural additions to use wrought iron detailing consistent with the community's approved architectural palette. I called the management office, genuinely more confused than angry at that point, and asked how a safety ramp for a disabled veteran could be subject to a decorative railing guideline clearly written with things like porch rails and garden fencing in mind. The woman I spoke with told me apologetically that she understood my frustration, but that all citations had to go through the standard appeals process with the board, and that in the meantime, the compliance clock would continue running. I filed a formal accommodation request under the Fair Housing Act that same week, citing my documented disability and the ramp's function as a medical necessity rather than an aesthetic choice, a request that, based on everything I understood about how these situations were supposed to work, should have ended the matter immediately and definitively. Federal law is not particularly ambiguous about a homeowners association's obligation to provide reasonable accommodations for a resident's disability-related needs, and a functional wheelchair ramp is about as clear-cut an example of exactly that kind of accommodation as exists. Dolores's written response, delivered about 2 weeks later, did not deny my accommodation request outright, which I later learned was a deliberate strategy rather than an oversight. Instead, she stated that the board recognized the importance of accessibility, but felt the railing specifically, as opposed to the ramp's basic structure, remained subject to reasonable aesthetic modification requirements that could be met without compromising functionality, and gave me 45 days to replace the railing with an approved style or face escalating fines. I want to explain something here that I think matters enormously, because it's the exact kind of technical maneuvering that lets HOA boards get away with targeting disabled residents while maintaining just enough plausible deniability to make a straightforward legal challenge harder than it should be. Dolores wasn't claiming she could ban my ramp outright, which she almost certainly knew would be an obvious, indefensible fair housing violation. She was instead trying to force a modification to it, framing the fight as being about railing aesthetics rather than accessibility itself, a framing that, if successful, would let her claim she'd never actually denied my accommodation, only requested a reasonable adjustment to its appearance. The problem, which my own research over the following 2 weeks confirmed, and which I later had formally validated by an attorney, was that the specific railing style Dolores was demanding, a decorative wrought iron pattern with wider gaps between the vertical bars, would have significantly compromised the ramp's actual functional safety for someone with my specific mobility limitations, since I rely on being able to grip the railing continuously along its full length during transfers. Something the approved decorative style, with its wider spacing, simply didn't allow for safely. I submitted a second, more detailed accommodation request, this time including a letter from my physical therapist explaining specifically why the current railing style was medically necessary rather than a matter of personal preference, along with photographs demonstrating the grip pattern I required during transfers. I want you to sit with what happened next, because I think it's the moment that this entire situation crossed from frustrating bureaucratic overreach into something considerably more deliberate and considerably more personal. Dolores did not respond to the second accommodation request at all. Instead, about 3 weeks later, while I was at a scheduled physical therapy appointment and Michaela was at work, a construction crew, hired directly by the HOA under an emergency authorization Dolores later claimed fell within her discretionary presidential authority, installed a decorative wrought iron gate directly across the base of my ramp. The exact style she'd been demanding for the railing, except installed not as a railing modification at all, but as a literal locked barrier blocking the ramp's entire entry point, secured with a padlock for which, as I discovered when I called the management office in a state of genuine disbelief that evening, only the HOA maintenance staff and board members held keys. I came home from physical therapy that afternoon, tired and sore in the specific way those appointments always leave me, to find that I could not get up my own ramp into my own house without someone physically unlocking a gate that had been installed, according to the notice zip tied to it, as part of mandatory compliance enforcement pending resolution of the outstanding architectural violation. I sat at the bottom of that ramp for what felt like a very long time. Michaela, when she got home 20 minutes later and found me still sitting there, called the HOA emergency line immediately, and when nobody answered, drove straight to Dolores's house herself, something Michaela almost never does, since she's generally the more measured, patient one of the two of us in situations like this. She told me later that Dolores answered her own door, looked at the situation calmly, and said, essentially verbatim, "The gate can be unlocked once compliance discussions are finalized. I'm sure this is frustrating, but rules exist for a reason." I want you to understand that I have faced a lot of frustrating, dehumanizing bureaucratic obstacles in the years since my injury, insurance denials, inaccessible buildings, well-meaning strangers who talk to Michaela instead of directly to me as though I can't answer for myself. But sitting at the bottom of my own ramp that evening, locked out of my own home over a railing aesthetic dispute, is the single angriest I have been about any of it, and I want to be honest that my very first instinct was not a calm, strategic legal response. My very first instinct was fury, pure and uncomplicated, and it took Michaela and a phone call to an old friend from my unit named Desmond Okonkwo, who now worked as a disability rights advocate, to help me channel that fury into something that would actually accomplish what needed to happen instead of just making me feel briefly, uselessly better. Desmond, when I called him that night still sitting in my chair in the driveway because Michaela had thankfully found a spare key the maintenance crew had carelessly left in an unlocked utility box nearby, listened to the entire story without interrupting once, and then said something that reframed the entire situation for me. "Holland," he said, "what happened to you today is not a grey area. It's not a technical dispute about railing aesthetics anymore. A person was physically locked out of her own home due to a disability accommodation dispute, using a barrier that has no functional purpose beyond enforcement, installed while you were out of the house specifically so you couldn't object before it happened. That's not just a Fair Housing Act violation. Depending on how this state's disability access statutes are written, that may cross into something considerably more serious. And I think, before you do anything else, this needs to go public, immediately, loudly, and with documentation, because the kind of person who does something like this counts on nobody outside a small HOA bubble ever finding out about it." I called a local television reporter the very next morning, a woman named Yolanda Prut-Ferreira, who had coincidentally done a segment about accessibility issues in local government buildings about a year earlier that I'd remembered seeing and being impressed by. I sent her photos of the gate, the padlock, the zip-tied compliance notice, and a brief written account of everything that had happened over the preceding 2 months. She called me back within 4 hours, and the first thing she said, once I'd walked her through the full timeline, was, "I need to see this in person, and I want to be there when it happens again if you're willing to let a camera crew document it." That request led to a decision that, looking back, is probably the single most important strategic choice I made in this entire ordeal. And it's the reason this story ends the way it does, with Dolores Ashworth Hayes standing on live regional television, visibly flustered, in front of the exact gate she'd installed, unable to offer a single coherent explanation for why a decorated barrier had been locked across a disabled veteran's only entrance to his own home. Yolanda's plan, when she called me back the following day, was deliberately simple. Rather than simply filming an interview with me describing what had happened, she wanted to film the gate itself, still locked, still standing exactly where the HOA's crew had installed it, and she wanted to attempt to get Dolores on camera responding to direct questions about it, on the theory, which turned out to be exactly correct. That footage of an HOA president trying to explain a locked accessibility barrier in real time would be far more damning than any second-hand account could ever be. She and a cameraman arrived at my house on a Thursday morning, and I want to tell you, there's something strange and almost surreal about sitting at the bottom of your own ramp, gate locked in front of you exactly as it had been for nearly a week at that point, since I'd refused, on Desmond's advice, to have it removed or damaged before the story could be properly documented, while a news crew sets up equipment in your driveway. Yolanda interviewed me first, walking through the full timeline, the original approval under Walter's board, the railing citation, the accommodation requests, my physical therapist's letter, and finally the gate itself, installed while I was out of the house, locked with a padlock only HOA staff possessed keys to. Then, with the camera already rolling, Yolanda and her cameraman walked the short distance to Dolores's house, 3 streets over, and knocked on her door. I was not there for that part, obviously, but Yolanda later showed me the full unedited footage, and I have watched it, I'll admit, more times than is probably healthy, because there is a very particular satisfaction in watching someone who spent months hiding behind procedural language suddenly realize, in real time, that a camera crew is standing on her porch, and she has no prepared answer ready. Dolores answered her own door, and Yolanda, calm and direct, introduced herself and asked simply, "Can you explain why a wheelchair ramp belonging to a disabled veteran has been blocked by a locked gate for the past week?" The footage shows Dolores's expression shift almost immediately, a kind of practiced pleasantness sliding uncomfortably into visible discomfort. She started with what was clearly meant to be her standard response. Something about architectural compliance and community standards applied consistently to all residents, language I'd heard variations of throughout this entire ordeal. Yolanda, without raising her voice at all, followed up immediately. "Mr. Voss has submitted 2 formal accommodation requests under the Fair Housing Act, including a letter from his physical therapist explaining the medical necessity of the current railing design. Did the board respond to those requests?" Dolores hesitated visibly on camera, a pause that stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable even watching it secondhand months later, before saying that the board was still reviewing the documentation, a claim that Yolanda, who had by that point already reviewed the timeline with me in detail, immediately and calmly contradicted, noting that the second request had been submitted over 5 weeks earlier with no response of any kind before the gate was installed. So the gate was installed, Yolanda said, before the board had actually responded to his accommodation request at all. There is a long silence on that footage, nearly 6 full seconds, which sounds brief until you actually watch it happen, Dolores standing in her own doorway, visibly searching for something to say, before finally offering, "I would need to review the exact timeline before commenting further," a response that played on the evening news that same night alongside footage of the actual locked, gate-blocking Harlan Voss's ramp, did not land with viewers the way I imagined Dolores hoped it might. The segment aired that Thursday evening, running just over 5 minutes, and by Friday morning, it had been picked up and shared widely across several regional social media pages, along with, notably, a National Veterans Advocacy Organization's account that Desmond had quietly alerted in advance, whose repost brought the story to an audience considerably larger than the local viewing area Yolanda's segment had originally targeted. I want to walk you through what happened over the following 2 weeks, because the public pressure, while it mattered enormously, wasn't ultimately what forced the resolution here. That came, as it often does in these situations, from a combination of legal pressure and internal board pressure happening simultaneously. Desmond connected me with a disability rights attorney named Carmichael Osai, who specialized specifically in Fair Housing Act cases involving homeowners associations, and who told me, after reviewing the full timeline and the accommodation request documentation, that this was, in his professional opinion, one of the more straightforward violations he'd encountered in years of practice. The accommodation request itself is airtight, he told me. You have a documented disability, a documented medical necessity for the specific railing configuration, and a board that not only failed to respond within any reasonable timeframe, but actively installed a physical barrier preventing you from accessing your own home while that request remained unanswered. That's not a gray area under federal law. That's about as clean a Fair Housing Act violation as exists, and frankly, the fact that it's now been broadcast on regional television, with the board president unable to offer any coherent defense, makes this an unusually easy case to litigate, should it come to that. Carmichael filed a formal complaint with the Department of Housing and Urban Development within days, along with a separate demand letter to the HOA board directly, requesting the gate's immediate and permanent removal, a formal written accommodation approval for my original railing configuration, and compensation for the period during which I had been unable to safely access my own home without relying on an unsecured spare key that Michaela had happened to find by chance. The pressure inside the HOA board itself, meanwhile, was building independently of any legal action. Several board members, according to what I later learned from a neighbor who sat in on an emergency session called the following week, had been blindsided by the news coverage, having had no idea, they claimed, that Dolores had authorized the gate's installation without bringing it to a full board vote in the first place, relying instead on the same claimed discretionary presidential authority that, much like in other HOA disputes I've since heard about from friends dealing with similarly overreaching board presidents, turned out to have no actual basis in our community's governing documents once anyone bothered to check. That emergency session, held about 10 days after the news segment aired, was the moment this entire situation finally turned. Facing a formal HUD complaint, a demand letter from Carmichael mounting pressure from board members who felt blindsided and exposed to personal liability by Dolores's unilateral decision, and a level of negative public attention that had, by that point, made Fernwood Crossing something of a minor cautionary tale being discussed on local talk radio. The board voted, with Dolores abstaining, to immediately order the gate's removal, to formally approve my original railing configuration as a valid disability accommodation, and to open a broader review of Dolores's conduct as board president. I want to tell you about the day the gate came down, because it happened faster than I expected once the board actually voted. The same maintenance crew that had installed it arriving less than 48 hours later to remove it entirely. And I sat in my chair in the driveway that morning, Michaela beside me, watching that particular piece of wrought iron get carried away piece by piece, feeling something loosen in my chest that I hadn't fully realized had been sitting there, tight and heavy. For the better part of 2 months. Dolores resigned from the board about 3 weeks later, following what I understand was a formal vote of no confidence brought by the membership after the internal review into her conduct concluded that she had, in fact, authorized the gate's installation without proper board approval and in direct disregard of 2 pending federal accommodation requests. The HUD complaint concluded a few months after that with a formal finding against the association, resulting in a settlement that included compensation for the period I'd been denied access, along with mandatory Fair Housing Act training for the entire board going forward, a requirement I understand Fernwood Crossing's new board has actually taken seriously in the time since, unlike, I suspect, a great many HOA boards across the country who treat that kind of training as a box to check, rather than something that actually needs to inform how they treat residents. I still have that ramp, obviously, with its original railing. The one built specifically for how my hands actually need to grip it during a transfer rather than how a decorative style guideline decided it should look. I've thought a lot, in the time since, about how close this entire situation came to simply being absorbed and endured, the way so many accessibility fights are quietly, exhaustingly, without ever becoming the kind of story that makes it onto the evening news. If Michaela hadn't found that spare key. If Desmond hadn't known exactly who to call. If Yolanda hadn't been willing to show up with a camera crew and ask a simple, direct question on a stranger's porch. If there's a lesson in this, I think it's something Carmichael said to me during our very first meeting, sitting across from him in his office with the news segment still playing quietly on a laptop between us. He said that accessibility violations, more than almost any other kind of HOA overreach, tend to survive specifically because they happen in private, behind closed doors, in individual disputes that rarely reach anyone beyond the 2 people directly involved. The moment you take that private dispute and make it impossible to ignore, a locked gate on live television, a padlock with a compliance notice zip tied to it for a camera to zoom in on, the entire calculation changes because suddenly the person responsible isn't just answering to one frustrated homeowner anymore. She's answering to everyone watching, and it turns out there is no procedural language smooth enough to explain away the simple, undeniable image of a wheelchair ramp locked behind a decorative gate. Thumbnail text: SHE locked, MY wheelchair ramp shut.